My mother-in-law told me she had to move into our guest room because her rent was raised past her budget. Yesterday, I helped her set up her new tablet and saw the automated banking alerts for her secret high-yield savings account. It's just become unsustainable. Clara, my mother-in-law, Evelyn, had sighed, dabbing at the corner of her eye with a monogrammed handkerchief. She was sitting on our living room sofa, surrounded by 3 matching sets of designer luggage. The property management company raised my rent by 40%. On a fixed retirement budget, I simply can't afford to stay in the city anymore. I have nowhere else to go. I remember looking at my husband, Greg, whose face was a mask of intense guilt and worry. I am a compliance officer for a local credit union. My entire professional life is built on auditing financial realities, verifying statements, and managing risk. But when it came to family, I tried to leave my analytical brain at the office. I swallowed my reservations about losing our privacy, smiled warmly, and told Evelyn that our spare bedroom was hers for as long as she needed it. For 5 months, our quiet, disciplined household adapted to Evelyn's suffocating presence. She rearranged our pantry because our storage system lacked efficiency, criticized my cooking, and constantly reminded us how much she was sacrificing by living in our modest suburban home. Whenever Greg or I mentioned upgrading our aging vehicle or saving for our daughter Maya's upcoming middle school tuition, Evelyn would sigh loudly about the crushing weight of inflation and how we all needed to pinch pennies. We pinched pennies. We stopped going out for dinner, canceled our modest vacation plans, and took on extra shifts to ensure the household could support an extra adult without draining our emergency fund. The illusion of her financial vulnerability dissolved into a crisp, digital layout at exactly 4:30 p.m. yesterday. Greg had bought his mother a brand new tablet for her 72nd birthday, hoping it would keep her occupied during the long afternoons. Because tech setup makes him anxious, the task of configuring her profiles fell squarely on my shoulders. Just sync it to my old email address. Clara, dear, Evelyn had instructed carelessly, handing me the device before walking out to the garden. I don't understand these new interfaces. I sat at the kitchen island going through the standard verification protocols, but the moment the primary email inbox synced and refreshed over our home Wi-Fi network, a barrage of automated notifications flooded the top of the screen. They weren't newsletters or retail coupons. They were weekly automated balance statements from a premier online financial institution, addressed directly to Evelyn. My eyes, trained by a decade of asset verification, instantly locked onto the numbers in the primary deposit field. The liquid balance sitting in a secret high-yield savings account wasn't just enough to cover a rent increase. It was a sum large enough to buy her rented apartment building outright. Cash. I sat completely frozen at the kitchen counter, the tablet heavy in my hands as the automated notifications continued to line up on the screen. As a compliance officer, I review asset structures every day. I know the difference between a modest retirement safety net and an aggressive, actively managed wealth portfolio. Evelyn wasn't just financially secure, she was wealthy. I scrolled through the recent statement alerts to verify the timeline. The account had been generating thousands of dollars in interest alone every single month. More sickeningly, I noticed an automated transfer file from 5 months ago, the exact week she claimed she was being priced out of her home. She had moved a massive lump sum from her traditional checking account into this high-yield buffer, effectively making it look like her primary checking balance was depleted. She hadn't been forced out of her apartment by a greedy landlord. She had calculated that by eliminating her housing expenses entirely and living rent-free in our guest room, she could maximize her interest yield while letting Greg and me shoulder the financial burden of her daily lifestyle. The level of calculated manipulation made my blood run cold. For 5 months, she had watched me clip coupons, watched her son come home exhausted from working overtime, and watched her granddaughter skip summer camp, all so she could watch her interest compound in the dark. When Greg came home from his corporate accounting job that evening, he looked haggard. He dropped his briefcase by the door and immediately asked if his mother needed anything from the pharmacy. "She's fine, Greg," I said, my voice terrifyingly calm as I stood by the dining room table. "But you need to look at this." I laid the tablet down in front of him, the automated banking statement open to the primary asset summary. Greg leaned over the table, his eyes scanning the numbers. I watched his expression transition from confusion to disbelief, and finally to a deep, pale shock. This can't be right, Clara. This must be a corporate account for her old employer. She told me her savings were gone. "It's her personal account, Greg," I said softly, placing my hand over his trembling fingers. "Her Social Security number is listed on the tax disclosure at the bottom. Your mother didn't move in here because she couldn't afford rent. She moved in here because she wanted a free ride at the expense of our family." Greg sank into a dining room chair, burying his face in his hands. The silence in our home was heavy, broken only by the distant sound of the television in the guest room where Evelyn was watching her evening programs. "She let me take on the weekend consulting contract," Greg whispered, his voice thick with a mixture of exhaustion and betrayal. "I told her my back was hurting from the extra hours, and she told me me it builds character. She sat at our table and watched us stress over Maya's dentist bills. I know, I said, my professional detachment kicking in to protect my husband from breaking down. But we aren't going to yell. And we aren't going to cause a scene that upsets Maya. We are going to handle this exactly like an audit. I spent the rest of the evening compiling the disclosures. I cross-referenced the interest yields against our household expenditure reports for the last 5 months. Evelyn had consumed hundreds of dollars in utilities, groceries, and medical transportation, all while paying $0 toward the household. On Friday evening, while Maya was at a scheduled school sleepover, I asked Evelyn to join Greg and me at the dining room table after dinner. She walked into the room with her usual frosty elegance, adjusting her cardigan as she took a seat at the head of the table. What is this about, children? If this is about the grocery budget again, Clara, I really must insist we buy the premium brand of tea. The store brand is entirely unpalatable. We aren't here to discuss the tea, Evelyn, I said, sliding a neatly printed folder across the mahogany table. We are here to discuss your asset structure. Evelyn glanced down at the folder. The moment her eyes caught the bold logo of her high-yield banking institution, her aristocratic posture instantly locked up. The polite, fragile grandmother facade vanished, replaced by a sharp defensive glare. Clara, this is an egregious violation of my personal privacy, she snapped, her voice dropping into a cold, commanding register. You had no right to look at my financial documents. Gregory, control your wife. Greg didn't look away. For the first time since his mother moved into our home, he looked her dead in the eye without a single hint of fear. Clara didn't violate anything, Mom. You asked her to set up your tablet. The bank alerts were sent to your main screen. The only lie here is the one you've been telling us for 5 months. It is none of your business how I choose to manage my retirement capital, Evelyn countered, her chin rising as she tried to regain control of the room. I worked my entire life for that money. What I choose to save is my business. I am a senior citizen on a fixed income, and housing costs are volatile. Your income isn't fixed when your liquid interest yield matches my husband's monthly salary. Evelyn, I said, keeping my tone perfectly professional, standard auditing voice. And it becomes our business when your wealth preservation strategy requires my household to subsidize your daily life under fraudulent pretenses. Evelyn stood up, her hands flat on the table as she looked down at us. I am family. I shouldn't have to pay admission to stay in my own son's home. The Bible says to honor your parents, Gregory. Honoring a parent doesn't mean allowing them to exploit my wife and child. Mom, Greg said, his voice steady, holding a profound, quiet dignity that made me incredibly proud. We didn't ask you for admission. We offered you a safety net because we thought you were drowning. Turns out you were just using us as a stepping stone to build a larger portfolio. Brenda, Greg's sister, had clearly been clued into the situation because right then, my phone began to buzz with a text message. Evelyn had obviously messaged her before dinner. The text read, "Why are you attacking Mom about her savings? She's an old woman and needs security." I didn't reply to the text. I simply laid out the secondary legal memorandum I had drafted with our credit union's compliance counsel friend. Evelyn, I said smoothly, as a banking professional, I am legally obligated to ensure that any adult dependent residing in my home who claims financial hardship for tax or asset classification purposes is fully disclosed. If you remain in this house without contributing to the household infrastructure, while holding an undisclosed offshore high-yield asset, it creates a material non-compliance issue for our joint filing status. We aren't risking our careers for your interest rates. Evelyn looked at the legal disclosure sheet, then at her son, realizing that her script of fragile dependency had been completely dismantled by cold, hard compliance data. What do you want from me? Evelyn demanded, her voice finally losing its elegant edge, sounding thoroughly defeated and small. You want to strip an old woman of her security? No, Evelyn, I said, closing my folder with a firm, decisive click. We want transparency, and we want our boundaries restored. You have 2 choices. You can either transition into a luxury independent living community downtown, which this statement proves you can easily afford, or you can stay in our guest room under an ironclad, legally binding lease agreement. I slid the lease contract forward. It required a monthly market rate contribution for rent, a third of the utility infrastructure costs, and a full reimbursement of the grocery expenditures we had covered over the last 5 months. Furthermore, it explicitly stated that all household decisions, schedules, and management remained solely under my and Greg's jurisdiction. Evelyn stared at the contract as if it were a declaration of war. This is completely cold. Clara, you are treating family like a business transaction. You treated our family like a business transaction the minute you calculated that our stress was worth an extra fraction of a % on your interest yield, Greg said quietly. Sign the lease, or our moving coordination team team will have your bags delivered to the corporate suites downtown by Monday morning. The choice is yours." The room fell into a dead, suffocating silence. Evelyn looked at her son, searching for the old, easily manipulated boy she had managed for decades. But she only found a man who had finally chosen to protect his own home. With a sharp, indignant sigh, she snatched up our fountain pen and signed her name at the bottom of the lease agreement. She didn't look at either of us as she stood up, gathered her folders, and retreated back into the guest room, closing the door firmly behind her. The atmosphere in our home changed instantly. It wasn't a cinematic reconciliation, and there were no tears of apology, but the heavy, secretive weight that had been sitting on our household for 5 months was entirely gone. The air felt cold, but it was finally clean. The next morning, Evelyn had her corporate moving coordinator schedule the transfer of her belongings. She chose the luxury senior high-rise downtown, deciding that if she had to pay market rate, she would rather have a concierge service than our spare bedroom. We didn't stop her, and we didn't offer to pack her bags. We maintained a polite, respectful distance, ensuring the transition was handled with complete dignity for Maya's sake. This evening, Greg and I sat out on our backyard patio, watching our daughter read her book on the lawn. For the first time in months, Greg's shoulders weren't hunched with stress. The weekend consulting contract had been canceled, and his schedule was back to normal. "The first reimbursement check cleared this afternoon," I said, taking a sip of my tea. "Maya's middle school tuition account is fully restored, and our emergency savings are back where they belong." Greg reached across the small table and took my hand, his grip warm and steady. "Thank you," he said softly. "For what?" "For using your compliance brain to save our family. I was too close to it to see the pattern. You stood your ground when I couldn't." "We stood our ground together, Greg," I reminded him, looking out at the peaceful yard. "That's what a partnership is. We still have a long road of boundary management ahead of us." The relationship with Evelyn is formal and distant, limited to structured visits at neutral locations, and the extended family drama with Brenda remains unresolved. But as I watched my husband walk out onto the grass to play catch with our daughter, I knew that the ledger had finally been balanced. We weren't funding her secret portfolio anymore. We were finally standing on our own solid ground.